The Chamber of Convergence was not built for comfort. It was built for survival. Carved into the asteroid body of Valdresketh, a cold and lightless rock drifting at the outer edge of the Orion Spur, the chamber had been convened exactly 41 times across 11,000 years of recorded interstellar history. 41 times, the Galactic Council had gathered its member species beneath the vaulted obsidian ceiling and the faint blue glow of the Accord flames, ancient gas burners that had never once been extinguished, and debated whether civilization itself would survive another generation. 41 sessions. 39 resolutions. 2 catastrophic failures. The breath collapse of 7,200 years ago remained the Council's most studied failure, a cascading political breakdown that had allowed the Shriven Swarm to overrun 4 inhabited systems before the Council's military coalition could coordinate a response. The delay cost an estimated 9 billion lives across 3 species. The second failure, the Dravari Schism, had fractured the Council's eastern bloc for 6 centuries and left entire trade corridors dark. The Council remembered its failures with the same reverence it afforded its victories. Memory, the founding Accord stated, was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. Now, on the 42nd convening, the chamber held 47 species. And one of them was new. The delegation from Earth had arrived via a converted diplomatic transport, a modified version of one of their Meridian-class deep space vessels, stripped of its military sensor arrays as a gesture of good faith and refitted with communication equipment calibrated to the Council's frequency bands. The ship itself was unremarkable by interstellar standards. It was functional, well-maintained, and clearly engineered by a civilization that had not yet achieved full mastery of gravitational propulsion. They were still burning reaction mass, still fighting physics rather than negotiating with it. Councillor Chanvel of the Ethani Directorate had noted this in her pre-session brief with something between professional detachment and private relief. A young species. Newer than anyone here. Still using chemical and nuclear drives for deep system transit. Still ironing out the early wrinkles of interstellar travel. Good, she had thought. A young species would be easier to manage. She had been wrong before. But not, she believed, like this. The issue before the Council was not new in concept, only in scale. 17 months ago, long-range sensor relays positioned along the spinward boundary of Council space had begun returning anomalous readings, compressed energy signatures consistent with coordinated FTL exit events. Not the organic, exploratory spread of a single-species migration. Something structured. Methodical. Something that moved with the unmistakable geometry of military logistics. The Veth Dominion had been expanding for 3 centuries. Every species in the chamber knew it. The Veth moved slowly, deliberately, absorbing border territories through a combination of economic coercion, political infiltration, and, when those tools failed, precision military force. They did not conquer in the old sense. They integrated. They absorbed. The species they consumed still existed technically. Their population still lived technically. But their governments answered to Veth command structures, their resources fed Veth industrial complexes, and their children were educated in Veth ideology from the first year of formal schooling. It was a form of conquest so clean that it left no blood on the hands, or at least, none visible enough to justify the Council invoking the defense protocols. Until now. The sensor data from the spinward boundary told a different story. 43 Veth fleet elements, not patrol craft, not survey vessels but capital-class warships, had been detected repositioning along a corridor that pointed directly at the Therial cluster. Therial was home to 3 Council member species. Combined population, approximately 60 billion. The Council had been debating for 3 months. 3 months of procedural review, of evidentiary standards, of political triangulation between member species who feared the Veth and member species who quietly profited from Veth trade agreements. 3 months of the Accord flames burning low while diplomats measured their words with instruments finer than any weapon. And then the humans had requested the floor. Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the delegates' podium with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from discipline. She was 44 years old. She had spent 11 of those years in the Earth Diplomatic Corps and 7 before that as a strategic analyst for the United Nations Space Command, a body that had not existed 30 years ago and now managed the defense posture of an entire species learning, in real time, what it meant to live in a populated galaxy. She looked at the chamber around her. 46 other species. Beings who had been navigating interstellar politics since before humanity had developed written language. Beings who had watched civilizations rise and fall with the detached patience of geological processes. She did not feel small. She felt, precisely, the weight of what she represented. "Counselors," she said, her voice translated through the chamber's harmonic relay system into 47 simultaneous frequencies. "I want to begin by acknowledging that humanity is the youngest member of this body. We have been formal members of the Galactic Council for 11 years. We have no centuries of precedent here, no deep history with the protocols and traditions that govern this chamber." Pause. Deliberate. "But we do have a perspective that may be useful." Chanvel of the Ethani Directorate felt something shift in the chamber's ambient attention, the subtle, collective adjustment of 47 species redirecting focus. She had been in this chamber for 30 years. She knew what that shift felt like. It felt like the moment before something changed. "The Veth Dominion has repositioned 43 capital-class vessels along a corridor with one logical terminus," Vasquez continued, her voice level and precise. "You have been debating the evidentiary threshold for invoking the defense protocols for 92 days. The Veth know your threshold. They have been operating just below it, deliberately, for 3 centuries. She let that sit. They are not waiting for you to decide. They are waiting for you to delay long enough that the decision no longer matters." The silence in the chamber was different from other silences. It was not the silence of disagreement. It was not the silence of offense. It was the silence of 46 species confronting a sentence they already knew was true but had not yet said out loud. Vasquez did not press the advantage immediately. She had been trained, by people who understood both diplomacy and warfare, that the moment after truth lands is not the moment to speak. It is the moment to let truth do its own work. She waited. And in the waiting, something in the chamber of convergence began, quietly and irrevocably, to shift. After Ambassador Vasquez's opening statement, the chamber did not erupt. It deliberated. And that, to anyone who had studied the Council's history, was actually the more dangerous response. Eruptions could be managed. Anger exhausted itself. But deliberation, careful, procedural, interminable deliberation, was the mechanism by which the Council had watched the breath collapse unfold in slow motion 7 millennia ago. It was the same machinery that had allowed the Veth to absorb 12 border systems over 3 centuries without ever technically triggering a defense clause. Vasquez had anticipated this. So had the team behind her. The Earth delegation to the 42nd convening numbered 9 individuals. 3 were career diplomats. 2 were xenolinguists. 1 was a legal specialist in interstellar treaty frameworks who had spent the past 4 years doing nothing but studying the Galactic Accord's defense provisions in every translation available. 1 was a former naval officer turned strategic analyst. And 2, seated at the back of the human gallery, unremarkable in appearance and almost entirely silent, were operational planners from the Earth Strategic Defense Directorate. They had not come to the chamber to make speeches. They had come with a document. On the morning of the 42nd convening's 3rd day, the Earth delegation formally submitted what they called a Tactical Assessment and Coordinated Response Framework, a 70-page analysis of the Veth fleet positioning, cross-referenced against publicly available Council sensor data, historical Veth military doctrine recovered from absorbed border civilizations, and Earth's own independent analysis of the Spinward Corridor's navigational constraints. The document was not classified. It was not sealed under diplomatic protocol. It was submitted as open record, available to every member delegation in the chamber. Councillor Dravet of the Paulian Compact read the executive summary in the first hour. Then he read it again. He was a species that processed information through a distributed neural architecture, what humans would approximate as 4 simultaneous minds, and all 4 of them arrived at the same conclusion. The humans had done the homework that no one else had done. The Veth fleet repositioning had been analyzed before. Every major military power in the Council had run their own assessments. But those assessments had been conducted through the lens of the assessor's own military doctrine, their own assumptions about how a war in the Spinward Corridor would be fought. The Paulian analysis had concluded the Veth were bluffing, repositioning for political pressure rather than operational intent. The Ethani Directorate's assessment had been inconclusive. The Zorati Combine had suggested the fleet movements were logistical, not offensive. The Earth document said something different. It did not argue that the Veth were bluffing or not bluffing. It mapped the corridors. Specifically, it identified 7 navigational choke points between the current Veth fleet positions and the Therial cluster. Points where the gravitational geometry of the Spinward Corridor forced any large formation to compress, to slow, to become momentarily vulnerable. It calculated transit times to each choke point under standard Veth drive profiles. It overlaid those transit times against the Council's current defensive readiness posture and identified the gap. A 41-day window during which the corridor could be contested with a fraction of the force required to meet the Veth fleet in open engagement near Therial. 41 days. The Veth were, by Earth's calculations, currently 22 days into that window. The response from the senior council delegations was not immediate enthusiasm. It was careful, professional skepticism, which Vasquez had also anticipated, and which she privately considered the correct response. Councillor Chanvel of the Ethani Directorate requested a formal review session with the Earth delegation's strategic team. It lasted 6 hours. The Ethani brought their own analysts, beings who had been studying interstellar military strategy for longer than humanity had been using iron, and they went through the Earth document section by section, challenging assumptions, probing the methodology, testing the navigational calculations against their own independent models. At the end of 6 hours, the lead Ethani analyst, a quiet being named Travash who communicated through low-frequency harmonic resonance and required a specialist translator, produced a single-sentence summary of his team's findings. The translation came through as, "The arithmetic is correct." It was not enthusiasm. It was not endorsement. But from Travash, who had publicly contested the navigational assumptions of 3 other council member species in this same chamber over the past decade, it was remarkable. What followed was not a vote or a declaration. It was a conversation. The kind that happens not on the chamber floor but in the corridors and private meeting rooms and pressurized galleries where real decisions take shape before they are formally proposed. Vasquez moved through those spaces with care. She was conscious, always, that she was operating in a political ecosystem that predated Earth's first civilization by millennia. She was not there to dominate the conversation. She was there to make a specific argument, once, clearly, and then let the architecture of the Council's own decision-making do the rest. The argument was simple. The defense protocols existed because the Council's founders had understood something that was easy to forget during periods of relative stability, that the cost of acting too early was always lower than the cost of acting too late. The 41-day window was not a guarantee of success. But it was the last window in which success was mathematically plausible. After that window closed, the question would no longer be whether to defend the Therial cluster. It would be how to negotiate the terms of its absorption. On the 4th day of the convening, Councillor Chanvel did something that had not been done in 200 years of Ethani Council participation. She formally co-sponsored a resolution with the Earth delegation to invoke a limited version of the defense protocols, authorizing the Council to preposition defensive assets at the 3 highest priority choke points identified in the Earth document. Not an act of war. Not a declaration of hostility. A repositioning. A statement, made in the language of fleet logistics, that the Council was paying attention. The Veth would understand that language. They had been speaking it for 3 centuries. The vote was not unanimous. 12 delegations abstained. 3 voted against. But 32 delegations voted in favor. More than enough for the threshold required under Article 7 of the Defense Protocols. The accord flames in the chamber burned steady as the count was read. Vasquez did not celebrate. She made a note in her operational log, flagged a priority communication to Earth Strategic Command, and began preparing the briefing materials for the next phase. They had 19 days left in the window. The real work was starting now. The Veth Dominion's intelligence apparatus was, by most metrics, the finest in the known galaxy. This was not an exaggeration or a point of propaganda. It was a structural reality born from 3 centuries of methodical expansion. The Veth did not move into a new territory without first spending decades building a comprehensive picture of it. Its political fault lines, its economic dependencies, its defensive weaknesses, and most critically, the precise threshold of provocation its governing bodies could absorb before either capitulating or fighting back. That last variable, the provocation threshold, was the instrument the Veth had tuned most carefully. They had learned, through long practice, that most civilizations had a zone between concerned and committed that could be maintained almost indefinitely with the right calibration of pressure. Keep the threat real enough to be credible. Keep it just ambiguous enough that the political cost of response exceeded the political cost of restraint. Then wait. The strategy had worked on the Dravari border worlds. It had worked on the Paulian fringe colonies. It had worked on the Surati trading posts along the 3rd corridor. Every time the targeted civilization had found reasons, good reasons, reasonable reasons, procedurally defensible reasons, to delay the decision point until the decision was irrelevant. 3 centuries. 12 absorption events. 0 open military conflicts. The Veth had studied the Galactic Council the same way they studied everything else, with patience and precision. They knew the Council's decision-making architecture better than most Council members did. They knew the average resolution time for invoking the defense protocols was between 4 and 7 months. They knew which delegations held swing votes and what those delegations needed to abstain rather than oppose. They knew that the Therial cluster's 3 constituent species had a long history of internal diplomatic friction that made coordinated defense advocacy difficult. What the VEF had not modeled, because it had not existed as a variable before 11 years ago, was Earth. Fleet Commander Sovedeth received the sensor report at 0340 Standard Time, in the command center of the VEF Ascendancy, the flagship of the 43rd Repositioning Fleet. The report was flagged routine. It was not routine. 12 Council vessels had entered the Ketharis choke point, the narrowest navigational passage in the Spinward Corridor, a gravitational lens formed by a dense stellar remnant that forced any large formation into a compressed transit window roughly 4 hours long. The Council vessels were not warships in the traditional classification. They were a mix of the Ethani Directorate's picket cruisers, 3 Polyan compact defense platforms, and 6 vessels that Sovedeth's identification systems classified as Earth Meridian-class deep-range ships. The military variant, not the diplomatic configuration. 12 vessels at Ketharis. Positioned not to block the corridor, 12 ships could not block 43 capital vessels in any scenario, but to observe it. To make their presence known. To be unmistakably on the record. Sovedeth stared at the sensor data for a long time. The Council had moved. In 3 centuries of VEF expansion, the Council had never prepositioned forces ahead of a formal conflict declaration. The defense protocols required it, Article 7 was clear enough, but the political process required to activate Article 7 had always, reliably, consumed enough time to make prepositioning irrelevant. 19 days. The Council had moved in 19 days. He sent an encrypted priority message to the Dominion Strategic Command. Then he began reviewing the transit calculations for the choke point sequence ahead. If the Council had 12 ships at Ketharis, the question was what they had, or would have, at Dravati and Sarali, the 2nd and 3rd choke points. The answer, when his analysts returned it 40 minutes later, was not reassuring. Back in the Chamber of Convergence, Vasquez received the first operational confirmation at 0712 Chamber Standard. The Council prepositioning forces had completed their transit to Ketharis without incident. The VEF fleet had not altered course. But they had slowed. The slow was the signal. She had explained this to Chanvel the night before, in the private council that had become their working habit over the past 2 weeks. Ethani diplomatic formality and human directness finding, gradually, a functional rhythm. A fleet moving toward a target does not slow for sensor contacts it isn't worried about, Vasquez had said. If they slow, it means their command element is running new calculations. That means our positioning has introduced a variable they didn't account for. Chanvel had asked the reasonable follow-up, and if they decide our forces are insufficient to change their calculus? Then they continue on course and we've learned something important about the limits of political signaling. But I don't think that's what happens. Vasquez had paused. The VEF have gotten where they are by never taking unnecessary losses. Ketharis is a choke point. 12 ships defending a choke point don't need to defeat 43. They need to make the cost of forcing the passage high enough that the strategic calculation changes. You're speaking in terms of deterrence. That's what this has always been. The VEF don't want to fight. They want absorption at minimal cost. Choke point defense changes the cost profile. Pause. That's why they slowed. On the 14th day after the vote, 2 things happened simultaneously. The first, VEF 43rd Fleet formally altered its heading by 7 degrees, a navigational change that, plotted forward, took them away from the direct Therial corridor and toward a holding position near the Valdris outer band. Not a retreat. But not an advance. The second, the VEF Dominion's diplomatic mission, which maintained a small, formally unacknowledged observation post within 2 transits of the Chamber of Convergence, submitted a request for informal consultations with the Council Secretariat. They wanted to talk. In the Earth delegation's working space, a pressurized module attached to the human residential quarter of the Valdrisketh complex, functional in the way that military planning spaces are always functional, the strategic team received both pieces of news within 6 minutes of each other. The former naval officer, Commander Ray Okonkwo, who had said very little in the chamber and considerably more in these rooms, looked at the navigational change plotted on the tactical display and said, "They blinked." No one celebrated. They had been here long enough, all of them, to understand that the moment an adversary blinks is precisely the moment that requires the most careful attention. The VEF had not retreated. They had repositioned to a space that gave them options. And they had requested talks. which meant they were shifting from military to political pressure, not abandoning the pressure. Vasquez was already drafting the Council's recommended negotiating parameters. 3 pages. Clear objectives, clear red lines, clear verification requirements. Outside, in the wider galaxy, 60 billion people in the Therial cluster were going about their days without knowing that the most consequential diplomatic maneuver in 40 years had just been executed, quietly and without a single shot fired, in a cold asteroid at the edge of the Orion Spur. And at the center of it was a species that 11 years ago had not been allowed to park a ship in Council space without a licensed escort. The consultation request from the Veth Dominion was, on its surface, a routine diplomatic instrument. It was addressed to the Council Secretariat, formatted according to the standard interpolity communication protocols established under the Second Accord Revision, and carried the appropriate seals and encryption signatures of the Veth Foreign Directorate. Nothing in its language was threatening. Nothing in its language was particularly revealing. It requested a meeting. It proposed a date. It suggested a neutral venue, one of the Council's 3 designated consultation stations, a small but well-equipped facility orbiting a gas giant at the corridor's edge. What it did not do was acknowledge the 12 Council ships currently positioned at the Ketharis choke point. This absence was noted by every senior diplomat in the chamber within 30 minutes of the message's receipt. The Veth were asking to talk as if the fleet repositioning had not happened, as if the previous 3 months of Council debate had not happened, as if they were initiating contact from a position of uncomplicated good faith. Councillor Chanvel, who had been navigating Veth diplomatic signals for the better part of 2 decades, read the message twice and said to no one in particular, "They want us to let them reset the frame." Vasquez, who had been provided a copy through the Council's new interdelegation information sharing protocol, another recent change, another small shift in the architecture of how the Council operated, read it once and said, "We shouldn't let them." The question of who would represent the Council at the consultation was itself a negotiation. The standard practice was for the Council's senior rotating chair, currently held by the Ethani Directorate, to lead any formal contact with a non-member polity. Chanvel was the obvious choice. She was experienced, credible, and had the institutional authority that the consultation required. But the Earth delegation submitted a formal proposal, a joint representation structure with Chanvel as lead and Vasquez as co-representative. The justification was operational. The Council's current negotiating posture was built, in part, on the strategic analysis the Earth delegation had provided. Having the architecture's author in the room would ensure consistency between the analytical basis and the negotiating position. It was a reasonable argument. It was also, as several delegation observers noted privately, a precedent, the first time a First Contact Era member species would participate at the primary level in a Council negotiation with a major power. The proposal passed with 31 votes. Not because 31 delegations were enthusiastic about the precedent. Because 31 delegations had read the Earth document, watched the Veth slow at Ketharis, and concluded that whatever the humans were doing, it was working. The consultation station was small by interstellar standards, a pressurized ring structure designed to accommodate delegations of up to 20 beings across its 4 meeting modules. The Veth delegation arrived first. 6 individuals, formally dressed, all of them carrying the precise, measured composure of beings who had done this many times before. Their lead negotiator was named Prethsola, a senior foreign directorate official who had, by available records, been involved in the absorption negotiations for 3 of the Veth's last 5 territorial integrations. He was very good at what he did. He greeted Chanvel with the appropriate interpolity formalities, the specific gesture sequence and tonal register that the Veth and Ethani had developed over a century of diplomatic contact, a small ritual that acknowledged history and implicitly hierarchy. He greeted Vasquez with a version of the same formality adapted for First Contact Protocol, correct, professional, and carrying in its correctness the faintest suggestion that he considered her presence here irregular. Vasquez noticed. She did not respond to the suggestion. She took her seat, opened her notes and waited. Prethsola's opening position was elegant in the way that all Veth diplomatic openings were elegant, structured to appear as a concession while actually advancing the frame. He acknowledged that the 43rd Fleet's repositioning had been perceived as provocative by some Council members, a careful formulation that attributed the problem to perception rather than action. He expressed the Dominion's ongoing commitment to stable relations with the Council. He proposed a mutual force reduction arrangement under which both the Veth Fleet and the Council's choke point forces would return to their pre-crisis positions, followed by a structured dialogue about the Therial region's long-term security architecture. Mutual reduction. Both sides step back. Nobody loses face. It was the kind of offer that, 3 months ago, would have been received as a significant concession. It probably would have been accepted. Chanvel turned to Vasquez with a small gesture that, in the body language of beings who had worked together closely under pressure, meant, "You're red." Vasquez had spent 6 days preparing for this exact moment. Not preparing speeches, preparing silence. Knowing what not to say until the room required it. She said, "The Council's forces at Ketharis are a defensive positioning under Article 7. They're not analogous to an offensive fleet repositioning. We don't consider them equivalent." Prethsola's response came after a pause that was half a second longer than his previous responses. A small thing. A measurable thing. The Dominion's fleet movements were navigational in nature. 43 capital vessels on a heading with one logical terminus is a strategic posture, not a navigational routine, Vasquez said. Her tone was not aggressive. It was precise, the kind of precision that does not allow room for the reframe. We're not here to argue about what the sensor data shows. We're here to discuss what comes next. Another pause. And what does the Council propose comes next? Prethsola asked. What came next was Vasquez's second document. If the first document, the tactical assessment, had been about the corridor, the second was about the conversation. It was 15 pages. It proposed not a mutual step back but a structured verification arrangement. The Veth fleet to maintain its current altered heading for a minimum of 90 days, with Council observer assets permitted to confirm position. In exchange, the Council's choke point forces would reduce from 12 vessels to 6, enough to maintain operational credibility without escalating. And then a dialogue on Therial. But not a dialogue about Therial's security architecture. A Veth formulation that implied the cluster's defense was a problem to be solved cooperatively, which implied Council acceptance that Veth interest in Therial was legitimate. Instead, a dialogue about the Spinward Corridor's navigational protocols. A technical conversation. One that kept Therial's sovereignty off the table entirely. Prethsola read the document. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He said he would need to consult with the Directorate. He was in the room for 4 hours. He left without conceding anything explicitly. But when the Veth delegation's transport departed the station, it broadcast a navigational update on the open frequency, standard practice for vessels declaring an itinerary. The heading filed was for the Veth Frontier Depot at Soreth Station. Not Therial. Chanvel stood at the observation port and watched the Veth ship's drive signature fade into the corridor. She was quiet for a long moment. In 40 years of Council work, she said finally, I have never watched a Veth senior negotiator leave a room without having extracted something. Vasquez was closing her notes. He extracted information, she said. He knows exactly how we think now. That has value for them. And is that acceptable? It's the cost of doing business. We know how they think too. Pause. More than we did yesterday. When Councillor Chanvel returned to the Chamber of Convergence, she carried with her 2 things. The first was the consultation's formal record, a dry diplomatic document, factually accurate, appropriately hedged, written in the measured language that interstellar agreements require. It described the meeting, the positions exchanged, and the outcome as ongoing, which was the standard diplomatic designation for a process that had not concluded but had not collapsed. The second was a private assessment, shared only with the Council's inner deliberative body, describing what she believed had actually happened at the consultation station. The Veth had come expecting to negotiate a retreat, to find the diplomatic off-ramp that would allow both parties to step back from the edge without any formal acknowledgement of what the edge had been. They had expected to deal with the Council they knew, cautious, procedural, more concerned with institutional stability than with the strategic implications of any individual confrontation. They had not expected to find at the table a framework that treated the entire conversation as a verification and transparency problem rather than a crisis management problem. It was a subtle distinction. But in diplomacy, subtle distinctions are often the only ones that matter. The formal debate in the chamber on the consultation's outcome lasted 2 days. It was, by the Council's own standards, a short deliberation. Several delegations noted this explicitly, including the Zorati Combine's senior counselor, a being named Kvetharin who had spent 40 years observing the Council's operational tempo and who stated, without particular emotion, that the current pace of decision-making was anomalous and will require review. What he meant, though he did not say it directly, was that something had changed in the Chamber's institutional culture, and he was not yet certain whether that change was good. This was a legitimate concern. The Council's procedural deliberateness was not merely bureaucratic inertia. It was a hard-won recognition that decisions made quickly in complex political environments were frequently decisions made with incomplete information and insufficient consensus. The history of the 42 convening was full of cautionary examples. Speed had never been the Council's strength, but it had never needed to be. The Council's strength was durability, the capacity to outlast pressures that destroyed less robust institutions. Vasquez, invited to address the deliberative body on the second day, acknowledged this directly. The Council's institutional architecture was built for the long game, she said. And the long game is the right game for most of what you do. What happened in the Spinward corridor was not most situations. The Veth strategy depended specifically on the Council's decision-making timeline. They had calibrated their approach against it over 3 centuries. Pause. We are not proposing that the Council change how it operates generally. We are noting that its adversaries had already studied how it operates, and that awareness of this is a strategic asset. It was a careful framing. Not "you are too slow," which would have been accurate but offensive and counterproductive. Instead, your processes are known, and known processes can be anticipated, and anticipation is not always in your favor. The distinction mattered. A dozen delegations that had been privately skeptical of the Earth delegation's influence in the consultation process found themselves nodding at the formulation. The vote that followed was on a resolution that had, technically, nothing to do with the Veth situation. It was a procedural reform proposal, Article 14 Amendment 7 of the Council Operational Protocols. In its formal language, it was dense and unremarkable. A modification to the information sharing requirements between member delegations during active defense protocol proceedings, and the establishment of a rapid assessment subcommittee authorized to prepare coordinated strategic analyses within 72 hours of a formal request. No drama in the language. No grand declarations. But every senior diplomat in the chamber understood what it was. It was a structural acknowledgement that the Earth delegation's contribution to the Spinward corridor situation had been valuable, and a mechanism to ensure that contribution could be institutionalized rather than remaining dependent on the initiative of a single delegation at a single convening. In practical terms, it meant that the next time a border situation developed, the Council would have a formal analytical body, drawing from multiple delegations with Earth participation built into the architecture, to produce the kind of integrated assessment that had, this time, only existed because Vasquez's team had done the work unilaterally. The vote was 39 in favor. 6 abstentions. 2 against. The 2 negative votes were the Veth Dominion's Observer Mission, a non-member delegation with limited participation rights, and the Dravari Compact, which had its own reasons for preferring a council that moved slowly and predictably. Everyone else voted yes. Chanvel found Vasquez in the human delegation's common area afterward, in the hour before the formal reception that would close the day's session. She carried 2 cups of something warm, one calibrated to Ethani biochemistry, one that the station's synthesis systems had approximated as tea. She offered the tea without particular ceremony. "You understand what that vote means?" she said. "I understand what it might mean," Vasquez said. "Procedural reforms don't always translate into operational changes. This one will." Chanvel sat. Because the delegations who voted yes did so not out of idealism. They did so because they saw a concrete demonstration of what the reform could produce. You gave them evidence before you asked for the mechanism. That is not how this body usually works. We didn't plan it quite that deliberately. I know. That makes it more convincing. The Ethani counselor turned her cup in her hands, a gesture that Vasquez had come to recognize, over weeks of close collaboration, as indicating deep thought. "I want to ask you something direct." "Go ahead." "When you first prepared that tactical assessment, when your team first proposed bringing it to the Council, did you believe it would work? Or did you believe it was the right thing to do regardless of outcome?" Vasquez considered the question for a moment. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer. "Both," she said. "We believed it was accurate. We believed the window was real. If we'd brought an analysis that was wrong, no amount of institutional goodwill would have covered for that." She paused. "But yes, we would have brought it regardless. Because the alternative was watching 60 billion people's future get decided while we sat in the gallery and observed." Chanvel nodded slowly. "That," she said, "is exactly what the Council needed. And exactly what most of us had stopped being capable of." 90 days after the consultation at the Corridor Station, the Veth 43rd Fleet completed its movement to Soreth Station and filed a formal navigational record with the Council's Border Monitoring Authority, a procedural acknowledgement that the fleet was no longer operating in the spinward corridor zone. It was, technically, a compliance event under the verification framework that Vasquez's second document had proposed. The VETH hadn't agreed to the framework formally, but they had behaved as though they had, which was, in practical terms, the same thing. Or close enough. This was the part of the story that most observers focused on. The strategic win. The Council demonstrating that coordinated resolve could move a VETH fleet without firing a weapon. 60 billion people in the Therial cluster continuing their lives unaware of what had happened on their behalf. But in the Earth delegation's analytical division, which now operated as the formal nucleus of the Council's new Rapid Assessment Subcommittee, the attention had already moved past the VETH. Because the data had been showing something else for 3 weeks, and the data was harder to explain than fleet movements. Commander Okonkwo had noticed it first. He had been reviewing the long-range sensor relay network as part of the subcommittee's standard situational assessment, a practice inherited from Earth Strategic Command's protocol of continuous environmental monitoring, now applied to Council sensor assets with the expanded data access that the Article 14 amendment had authorized. The anomaly was not in the spinward corridor. It was anti-spinward, the direction no one had been looking, precisely because the VETH situation had consumed the Council's analytical attention for months. What the sensors showed was, on initial review, consistent with the background activity of the Garathi Passage, a loosely organized region of independent systems beyond the Council's formal border that had never been a significant strategic concern. The Garathi species were pre-interstellar or early post-interstellar, the older Council species had always assumed. Their radio emissions suggested technology several centuries behind the Council's frontier civilizations. What the anomalous readings showed was gravitational distortion signatures. Not natural ones. Large mass objects moving at sublight speeds through the outer Garathi systems. Very large. Moving in formation. Not Garathi. The Garathi didn't have the technology. Not VETH. The signatures didn't match VETH drive profiles. Not any known Council member species. Okonkwo had sat with the data for 2 hours before bringing it to Vasquez. He had checked it 3 times. Then he had asked the Ethani Directorate Sensor Team, now embedded with the subcommittee under the new protocols, to run an independent analysis. Their result came back in 18 hours. The Ethani had a word for what the signatures suggested, a technical designation in their astronomical lexicon that translated, roughly, as deep passage movement, a category created to describe large mass transit events in unexplored space that didn't fit natural phenomena. In 11,000 years of Council history, the designation had been used twice. Both times preceded first contact events with previously unknown civilizations. Both times, those contact events had been complicated. The subcommittee brief was delivered to the full Council on a Thursday, Chamber Standard Thursday, an arbitrary designation inherited from the second convening scheduling conventions, and it was the first brief that Vasquez delivered with explicit acknowledgement of the limits of the analysis. "We don't know what we're looking at," she said at the opening of the presentation. "That's the first thing to understand. We have gravitational distortion signatures in the outer Garathi systems consistent with large, coordinated mass movement. We do not have identification. We do not have drive signature matches. We do not have communication intercepts. What we have is the pattern, and the pattern does not fit any cataloged civilization in Council records." The Chamber's attention, already high after the spinward corridor situation, had a different quality now. The spinward corridor had been a known adversary, a known doctrine, a crisis that fit into familiar analytical categories. This did not. "Is this a threat?" asked Councillor Dravet of the Paulian Compact, in the direct idiom that the Paulian species favored. "Unknown," Vasquez said. "What I can tell you is that any civilization capable of moving objects of this mass at these speeds in coordinated formation has a level of engineering sophistication that should be noted." She paused. "We want to recommend a sensor deployment to the outer Garathi boundary. Passive observation, not active scanning. Nothing that can be interpreted as hostile. We want to see more before we characterize what we're seeing." The recommendation was approved in 40 minutes. The Council's new decision-making tempo was already showing in ways that the institution itself was still adjusting to. But the deeper implication of the Garathi readings, the one that was discussed not in the chamber but in the corridors and the private consultations and the late-night analysis sessions, was what it suggested about the VETH situation. The VETH had repositioned 43 capital vessels toward the Therial cluster and then, under political pressure, withdrawn them. That was the surface story. But 3 of the Council's senior strategic analysts, 2 Ethani and 1 from Vasquez's team, had separately arrived at a question that none of them had initially wanted to voice. Why had the Veth moved at that specific moment? The Veth's expansion doctrine was methodical, patient. It did not accelerate without cause. The timing of the Therial repositioning, which had seemed like simple opportunism in the context of council political dysfunction, looked different when overlaid against the Garathi anomaly timeline. The mass movement signatures in the outer Garathi systems had first appeared in sensor data approximately 14 months ago. The Veth fleet repositioning had begun 12 months ago. The gap was 2 months. Long enough, potentially, for Veth intelligence, which was excellent, to have detected the Garathi anomaly, assessed it, and concluded that the galaxy's political landscape might be about to change significantly. Civilizations facing uncertainty consolidate what they have. They weren't just being opportunistic about the Council's internal dysfunction, Okonkwo said in one of the subcommittee's late sessions. They were accelerating their expansion schedule because something has their attention in the outer systems. Vasquez stared at the 2 timelines overlaid on the display. Which means, she said slowly, that the Veth may have information about what's in the Garathi passage that we don't have yet. The silence in the room had a different texture than earlier silences. We need to talk to them, she said. Not confront. Not pressure. The Veth, it turned out, might not be the problem. They might be the second most worried party in the room. The 42nd convening of the Galactic Council had been called for a crisis. It was closing with a revelation. Not a dramatic one. No dreadnoughts breaking from hyperspace, no ultimatums delivered at gunpoint, no single moment of cinematic clarity that resolved everything neatly. The revelation was the quieter, more durable kind. The kind that arrives through accumulated evidence and forces a reconsideration not of events but of frameworks. The Galactic Council had spent 11,000 years as the galaxy's primary institution for managing civilizational scale problems. It had done this through a specific architecture, deliberate consensus, long institutional memory, careful balance of competing interests. It had worked. Imperfectly, with notable failures, with political compromises that sometimes felt like moral compromises, but it had worked. The galaxy's inhabited systems were, by any historical measure, more stable and more prosperous under the Accord than outside it. What the 42nd convening had revealed was that the architecture had a vulnerability it had never needed to address before. The civilizations that had built the Council, the Ithani, the Paulian, the Zorati, the others, were old civilizations. Not ancient in geological terms but old in political terms. They had learned, through their own wars and their own near collapses, to be cautious, to value process, to distrust the urgent and favor the durable. These were wise instincts, hard-won, and they were responsible for much of the Council's success. They were also, under specific conditions, a liability. The final session of the 42nd convening began with the Garathi sensor deployment authorization, now confirmed with the first passive observation assets en route, and moved to a broader item, the structural review of the Council's intelligence and early warning functions, which the Article 14 amendment had implicitly flagged as requiring modernization. The discussion was substantive and long. Vasquez participated but not as the dominant voice, deliberately. The subcommittee she had helped build was now including analysts from 7 member species, and several of them were sharper in specific domains than anyone in the Earth delegation. The Ithani Sensor team, once they had full access to the subcommittee's analytical framework, had identified 3 historical precedents in Council records for the Garathi mass movement signatures that Earth's analysts had missed entirely. The Paulian Compact's military doctrine specialists had contributed 2 scenario analyses that improved the Council's contingency planning in ways that Vasquez's team would not have produced independently. This was the part that mattered most. Not that humanity had solved the Council's problem, but that humanity's approach had created a space in which the Council's own accumulated knowledge could be applied more effectively. The subcommittee was not an Earth institution. It was, increasingly, exactly what it was designed to be, a Council institution with Earth participation, operating at a pace and integration level that the Council had not previously managed. On the convening's final formal day, Councillor Chanvel rose to deliver what would become one of the most referenced addresses in Council records. She began with history, as Ithani speakers always did, recounting the circumstances of the first convening, 11,000 years ago, when the Ithani and 2 other species had assembled in a much smaller facility on a different asteroid body and signed the original accord. She described what the founders had believed they were building. Not a government, not an empire, but an argument. A standing, institutional argument against the proposition that civilizations in proximity to one another must inevitably be in conflict. The accord was never about eliminating competition, she said. It was about ensuring competition did not become destruction. The founders understood that if you create a durable mechanism for managing disagreement, you change what disagreement means. You keep it within the range where it produces tension instead of catastrophe. That is all the accord has ever tried to do. She paused. What the 42nd convening has added to this history is a reminder that mechanisms age. That the problems they were designed to address are not the only problems that will exist. And that the willingness to adapt the mechanism, not to abandon it but to strengthen it, is itself part of the Accord's original intention. Then directly, 11 years ago, we admitted a new member to this body. A young species by our standards. One still learning the distances between stars. One that arrived here, at this specific convening, at this specific moment, without the assumptions that experience sometimes calcifies into habit. They did not look at the spinward corridor situation and see it through the lens of 3 centuries of managed Veth expansion. They looked at it and asked what the arithmetic actually said. She looked at the Earth delegation for a moment. The arithmetic, she said, was the thing we needed. After the session in the corridor outside the chamber, Vasquez was stopped by Kvetharan of the Zora T Combine, the counselor who had expressed concern about the changing institutional tempo. He was an old being by any species standard. He had been in the council longer than Earth had known that other inhabited worlds existed. He regarded Vasquez with an expression that, through the translator, carried something between skepticism and respect. I did not support the speed of this convening's decisions, he said. I want you to know that. I know, Vasquez said. I also do not believe my concern was wrong. Speed has cost. Consensus that forms quickly often has gaps that take years to find. He paused. But I reviewed the Garathi timeline analysis. The 2-month gap between the anomaly signatures and the Veth repositioning. Yes. If that correlation is correct, if the Veth moved because something in the outer systems alarmed them, then the Council was 3 months into a debate about a symptom while the underlying cause was developing without our attention. That's our current working assessment, yes. Kvetharan was quiet for a moment. I have been in this chamber for 40 years. I have watched the Council operate well and poorly. I have my own views about what operating well means. He regarded her steadily. What your team brought to this convening was not a strategy. Was attention. Focused, analytical attention applied to a specific problem set while the rest of us were managing the institution rather than reading what the institution was telling us. He turned to leave. Then stopped. I will be supporting the expansion of the subcommittee's mandate, he said. For the record. The 42nd convening formally closed with a document, as all convening sessions did. The document recorded the Article 14 amendment, the Garathi sensor deployment, the consultation framework with the Veth Dominion, and the expanded mandate of the Council's rapid assessment function. It recorded, for the first time in the Accord's formal history, the full participation of the Earth delegation in a primary negotiation with a major non-council power. It did not record the other things. The late-night analysis sessions. The conversations in corridors. The moment Shanvel had said that is exactly what the Council needed. The look on Prethsola's face when he realized that the human co-representative was not going to accept his frame. Those things do not go in documents. They go into institutional memory, the slow accumulation of precedent that changes, over time, how an institution understands itself. The Meridian Deep departed Valdresketh 7 hours after the closing ceremony. Ambassador Vasquez filed her operational report from the transit. It was thorough, factual, and concluded with a section titled Outstanding Issues that ran longer than the summary of achievements. The Garathi situation was unresolved. The Veth's actual intentions remained opaque. The Council's new mechanisms were untested at scale. 11 years of membership did not make Earth a galactic power, it made Earth a participant, which was a different and more complicated thing. She filed the report, closed her notes, and looked out at the corridor ahead. Somewhere in the outer Garathi systems, large objects were moving in formation through the dark. Passive sensors were quietly watching. Analysts on 6 worlds were running models. The galaxy, it turned out, was not waiting for anyone to finish deliberating. But for the first time in a long time, the institution responsible for responding to it was paying attention at the right speed. That was enough for now. That had to be enough.